Hi, everyone. Welcome to our book launch event. It'll be on Professor Charlotte Karem Albrecht's new book, Possible Histories, Arab Americans and the Queer Ecology of Peddling. I am Murad Idris. I'm an associate professor of political science here at the University of Michigan, and I am the interim director of the Global Islamic Studies Center. I'm delighted to have you all here with us and delighted to have our esteemed guests. The moderator and host today will be Professor Juan Cole, the Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History at the University of Michigan. I am very happy to turn it over to him.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Morad. And my name is Juan Cole. I'm the director of the Arab and Muslim American Studies program here at the University of Michigan in the Department of American Culture. And we, along with Global Islamic Studies Center, are your hosts today. I'm pleased to welcome the author of Possible Histories, Charlotte Karem Albrecht, as well as Professor Nayan Shah, joining us as the respondent from the University of Southern California. I will be your moderator today. Let me just turn to introductions. Charlotte Karem Albrecht is an assistant professor of American culture and women's studies at the University of Michigan, where she is also a core faculty member of the Arab and Muslim American Studies program and affiliated faculty for the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies. Her research interests include Arab American history, histories of gender and sexuality, women of color feminist theory, queer of color critique, and interdisciplinary historicist methods. Her first book, which we're considering today, Possible Histories, Arab Americans and the Queer Ecology of Peddling, was recently published with the University of California Press and is also available as an open access ebook. Karem Albrecht holds a PhD in feminist studies from the University of Minnesota. Her work has also been published in the Arab Studies Quarterly, Gender and History, the Journal of American Ethnic History, and several edited collections. Now, I'd also like to introduce our respondent, Professor Nayan Shah. Nayan Shah is a historian whose books cover how people struggle with incarceration, migration, illness in the United States and across the globe. His latest book, Refusal to Eat, A Century of Prison Hunger Strikes, from the University of California Press 2022, is the first global history of hunger strikes as a tactic in prison conflicts and protest movements. He also wrote Contagious Divides, Epidemics and Race in San Francisco's Chinatown, and Stranger Intimacy, Contesting Race, Sexuality, and the Law in the North American West. Shah is a professor of American Studies and Ethnicity and History at the University of Southern California. So I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Okay. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm just really excited to share this with all of you. I wanted to thank a few people first. I wanted to thank Aliyah Khan, who is the director of GISC, who's on leave right now, for suggesting this idea. I want to thank Murad and Juan, and especially Hannah Matar, who has done all of the logistics, all of the, careful details of setting this up today. And I really appreciate your attention and organization for all of this. And I want to thank Nayan for the time that he's given today to be here, and for all of the careful and generous engagement you've offered for my book throughout this process. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time to be here. Especially want to thank my friends and colleagues here at the University of Michigan, and also my friends and colleagues at the University of Minnesota, where this project began as when I was a graduate student. And I want to thank my partner, Katie, and my family. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came to this project. First, before I get into what the book is about and what the chapters are like. So the project began when I was a graduate student in feminist studies at the University of Minnesota. And this began at a time when I did not know that the field of Arab American studies existed. And I didn't know that the experience of my family was something that was embedded of a larger history of transatlantic Arab migration, affiliation, kinship, and labor. I have two people especially to thank for this: Ryan Cartwright, who introduced me to Sarah Gualtieri's work, and Rushan Kumar, who encouraged me to pursue what I then understood as merely a personal interest in family history, and he encouraged me to pursue this as a serious academic inquiry. As I started to learn about Arab American studies and Arab American history as a young graduate student, I learned that many Syrian migrants worked as peddlers. That is, that they were migratory sales folks. They did migratory sales work. And I want to mention that when I say Syrian in the book and in this presentation, I'm referring to a group of people who came from what was then the Ottoman province of Greater Syria. And this area in the late 19th and early 20th century encompassed the modern day boundaries of parts of Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, Israel. And most of the migrants who came to the United States from this area were Christian migrants. So peddlers and peddling showed up all over the place in archival collections on early Arab Americans, because so many of them did this labor for a period of time when they arrived. I was motivated in pursuing this project by two things. First, I wanted to understand the paradox I saw at the heart of early Arab American history. There's a narrative that peddling was key to early Syrian immigrants' ability to integrate into American society. But at the same time, I was also seeing archival materials that peddlers and other transient laborers were associated with ideas of sexual deviance and with queerness specifically. So how did this queer figure become reclaimed as a figure of respectability? The second thing I was motivated by was my desire to see sexuality at the center of scholarship on Arab Americans, and I was intrigued by the challenge of how to proceed when you seem to find no queer subjects in your community's archives. In Possible Histories, I advance both a thematic and a methodological intervention in queer studies, American studies, and Arab American studies. I focus on the work and representations of Syrian American peddlers and other Syrians involved in the peddling economy. I argue that the racial liminality that Syrian Americans experienced in the late 19th and early 20th century hinged on a complex and fluid entanglement of both Syrian and American sexual norms. The main intervention of this book is to examine both the discursive and material histories of what I call the queer ecology of the Syrian peddling economy, in order to unravel this entanglement. The queer ecology of peddling is a descriptor that names the peddling economy as a broader and more interconnected form and network than has traditionally been defined. That is, it expands our understanding of peddling labor to those who enabled it as a profitable and sustainable profession. This includes those who operated boarding houses, who made items for peddlers to sell, and those who took care of children and elders when peddlers were away. These laborers, of course, were primarily women, as were a number of peddlers themselves. The queer ecology of peddling is also a conceptual framework, specifically a queer analytic, that allows me to address the sexual, racial, and gendered implications of the Syrian peddling economy, and in the production of knowledge about the Arab American past itself. This conceptual framework attends to the contingent and curated nature of historical narratives. It asks, in other words, what was possible in these histories and what has been occluded from them? These are possible histories, and I use a practice I call historical grounded imagining to explore them. The subject of this book is also the archival collections themselves that have documented this history. I engage with the published scholarship and archival collection of the late Arab American historian Alixa Naff, among other sources. Although others have researched and continue to research this history of Arab migrants from the Levant, Naff's legacy, both in constructing a narrative about peddling in this early community and in leaving future generations a wealth of archival materials, is unparalleled. As I depend on her scholarly legacy, I simultaneously contend with the normativizing implications of her curatorial choices in both the community-based scholarship she produced and the community-based archive that she constructed. The Queer Ecology of Peddling also functions then as a framework for analyzing the historical narratives placed on peddling and peddlers in order to ask what those narratives have obscured and what power they have accrued. A particular kind of recuperative and respectable history of early Arab Americans has often been peddled, in which women appear as the spousal extensions of peddlers, men play the lead roles in the migration story, and Syrian immigrants effectively become white. I'm peddling a different history here, leaning on the rubric of possibility to center sexuality and gender without the assumption or expectation of heteronormativity. My use of the Queer Ecology of Peddling as an analytic uncovers a history of Arab American engagements with and investments in white supremacy that are simultaneously engagements with and investments in heteronormative sexual politics. As a result, Possible Histories functions as a project of queer Arab American critique, which aims to force a reckoning in queer studies and American studies. What particular practices, theories, and narratives are being peddled in these fields? How is knowledge validated, and what other knowledge is occluded in the process? This critique pushes against the parochialization of Arab American studies by those outside of it or by those ignorant of the field. So I'm going to give some brief chapter outlines. In the first chapter, I outline how the figure of the male Syrian peddler must be understood as a queer figure of Arab American and American history. To do this, I trace the slippages and dissonances between popular representations of Syrian peddlers and Syrian peddlers' own accounts of their peddling experiences. In literature, popular music, and news media, Syrian peddlers, particularly men, were depicted as the bearers of exotic excitement, a source of seductive danger, and the manufacturers of deceit. The encounter between a swarthy Syrian man and a naive white woman at her doorstep played out repeatedly in these representations. The threat of this racial and sexual encounter was ever present. The use of Orientalism in defining the sexual difference of peddlers reveals the anxieties that Syrian peddlers evoked about white racial purity, masculinity, and sexual normalcy. The experiences of peddlers bore out these anxieties, as can be seen through an examination of archival legacies of long-distance peddlers in particular. These sources also demand that we reckon with the opportunities peddling opened up for a variety of sexual experiences outside of heterosexual monogamous marriage. I use the occasion of tracking down one of my own peddler ancestors to consider his possible deviations from heterosexual monogamy in order to demonstrate a queer affective method. Chapter 1 focuses on one representation of Syrian peddlers, which continues to reverberate decades after its debut and holds a significant place in the cultural imaginary of the United States, the musical Oklahoma, and its peddler character, Ali Hakim, who's seen here on screen. I explore three iterations of this cultural work. The 1931 play antecedent to the musical called Green Grow the Lilacs, written by the queer Cherokee playwright Arlen Riggs. The 1943 stage musical Oklahoma by Rodgers and Hammerstein, and the eponymous 1955 film version of Oklahoma. Mirroring the trajectory of many Syrian Americans over time, the iterations of these cultural works demonstrate how peddlers were encouraged to assimilate by ceasing their movement and marrying white settlers. However, based on the representations of peddlers in news media and from their own recounting, they remained threatening as racial and sexual others. Chapters 2 and 3 investigate women's participation in the peddling economy. In Chapter 2, I do this in particular through the scrutiny that this labor attracted in the records of social welfare agencies, in which Syrians were both aid recipients and social reformers themselves. This analysis shows how Syrian women's peddling practices were at odds with norms of white middle-class femininity and threatened some Syrians' claims of whiteness, thus revealing the contours of what I call a sexual economy of the Syrian immigrant family. By this, I mean that the measures taken to discourage women from participating in the peddling economy emphasize that women's labor in the Syrian immigrant family should be essentially reproductive. At critical moments, I use the practice of historical grounded imagining to counter the omissions and characterizations of official records. Chapter 2 also illuminates the internal Syrian dynamics of class and its intersections with sexuality and gender by examining Syrian women both as clients of social welfare and as social reformers themselves. Chapter 3 continues the thread of Syrians' internal debates about peddling and traces it through the pages of the Syrian American press. Whereas the first 2 chapters illuminate marginalizing discourses about Syrian peddlers and begin to shed light on responses internal to the Syrian community, the 3rd chapter shows how Syrians produced self-normativizing discourses about women, marriage, and sexuality in Syrian migrant communities to make sense of and resist how they were perceived in the United States. Over a period of roughly 30 years, the Syrian press focused on Syrian women peddlers who were always imagined as unsupervised and unaccompanied by men in public spaces, and as thus threatening the idealized Syrian American identity that these elite Syrian migrants were crafting. By reiterating several arguments about the dangers that peddling posed to women, to the Syrian community, and to the community's reputation, and in particular, they were being linked with sex work. Writers claimed a link between peddling and an aberrant female sexuality. These debates index an elite migrant community's concerns about the parameters of normative Syrian sexuality as refracted through white and middle-class American ideals. Finally, Chapter 4 examines Arab American sexuality, gender, and race, not from the perspective of threat, violence, or policing, but rather from the perspective of pleasure, particularly those homosocial and homoerotic pleasures enabled by the very work of peddling. This chapter asks, how can we account for these pleasures historically when little evidence of Arab American homosexuality exists in our historical records? Using photographic materials from the Yamna and Faris Naf Arab American collection, I ask what historical traces remain of sexual non-normativity in Syrian peddler communities, given that most collected materials have been assembled to present a respectable image of Arab immigrants. In response, I conceptualize homosocial and homoerotic pleasure within the realm of what was possible, a more expansive view of pleasure than searching for an Arab American homosexual subject. I examine a series of gender-segregated photographs of peddlers from the 1920s that foreground multiple connections of pleasure between men or between women in Syrian American communities. I imagine the pleasurable possibilities of Arab American history that peddling enabled, and consider the ways that some Syrians may have resisted the self-normalization of their elite counterparts in the press. As I'm concluding, I'd like to read a small section from the conclusion. One of the things that's come up as people have talked to me about the book is that I sometimes get asked, despite the sort of emphasis of not looking for a so-called queer Arab American subject, or a subject that might map onto what we understand today as queer, gay, lesbian, bisexual, homosexual, I'll get asked, well, did you find anything like that? As a result, I wrote about this, this experience that I had in the conclusion. Throughout the journey to produce this book, I found, in quotation marks, an Arab American queer subject in only one instance. More concrete than a rumor, archivally speaking, the evidence nonetheless feels like a whisper. By the summer of 1962, Arab American historian Alixa Naff had a bachelor's degree from the University of California, Los Angeles, and took off to travel the United States and Canada in her blue Volkswagen Beetle. She was, quote, armed with a history degree, a tape recorder, and a grant from the university's folklore department. During that summer, Naff interviewed 87 first and second generation Syrian Americans and Syrian Canadians in 16 communities about their life histories. Almost 2 decades later, after she completed a PhD in history, a National Endowment for the Humanities grant allowed Naff to expand this endeavor into a major project, which formed the basis for her book. In one of these 1962 interviews, Naff sat down with her half-sister, Wadad Fren, who had come to the United States from Rashaya al-Wadi in 1921 when she was 6 years old. Wadad's father was a peddler, and Wadad and her mother learned to embroider pillowcases and make dust caps for him to sell. Around 1930, the family moved to Fort Wayne, Indiana, and opened a grocery store. Fort Wayne was a peddling hub where her father had many friends who were, like him, also from Rashaya. Thus, although most of the family was unhappy in Fort Wayne, Wadad's father enjoyed this place with its familiar faces. Naff's interview notes from the session contain, to my knowledge, the single instance of an Arab American lesbian from this history. Naff wrote that Wadad's father, who was also Naff's father, often gathered in the store with his old peddling friends and retold old stories. And she says that, quote, especially one woman, in parentheses, a lesbian, kept the group together. Like a leader, she was very respected, end quote. Given that the anxieties regarding peddler sexuality and queerness specifically were most visible in discussions of Syrian peddling men, the mention of a lesbian who was hanging out with her old male peddling buddies who was their leader to boot is striking. Because these were Naff's notes, which we see here on screen, and not transcripts, I cross-referenced them with audio from Naff's interview with her half-sister. Both the interview notes and the interview were in English. I wanted to see if the recording gave any indication of how Naff gleaned this parenthetical knowledge. In the recording, Naff and Wadad indeed discussed how Wadad's father liked to gather with this group of people. Wadad said that there was, quote, one particular woman that used to really keep them going. She, clears throat, was everybody's friend. She was in their clique. Naff was speaking, audio unclear. Of course, Dad enjoyed the association there, but not the rest of us, end quote. From there, the interview continued with no further mention of this woman or any clue as to how Naff might have determined that she was a lesbian. But both promise and excitement lie in this bit of archival material, as do confusion and doubt. Was this information gossip, or was it something that the person in question embraced and shared with others? Given the half-sibling relationship between Naff and Wadad, and given Naff's intimate knowledge of Syrian American communities, it's plausible that Naff had other knowledge of this woman beyond what was shared in this interview. Naff was raised in the same family as Wadad, and Ferris Naff, Wadad's father, who spent time with this person, was also Naff's father. Alixa Naff had lived in Fort Wayne for a few months during this time, so she may have known this woman directly. Perhaps in the indecipherable moment where Naff speaks, she's confirming the identity of the woman in question. I'm also intrigued by the capitalization of lesbian here, and given her propensity to use both Arabic and English in her notes, by Naff's use of the English word rather than attempting any equivalent in Arabic. In this pre-Stonewall moment in 1962 in the United States, was Naff signaling or revealing here her knowledge of the burgeoning gay liberation and lesbian feminist movements? Was Naff naming, quote, lesbian as an identity in its own right and purposefully avoiding Arabic or English terms that were derogatory? Without further evidentiary recourse, we are, of course, left to only imagine these things. Throughout Possible Histories, I show how gossip as a form of community self-policing disciplines Syrian immigrants and their descendants to uphold norms of white heteropatriarchy as evidence of their modernity. In contrast to this power of gossip and to the rumor about my great-grandfather with which I open this book, Naf's parenthetical lesbian can serve as a refutation and a resignification of community self-policing. As a woman who remained unmarried all of her life, pursuing a social and professional path that contrasted with those of many of her peers, Naf herself surely experienced the disciplinary mechanisms of such gossip. Even though this anecdote is minimized within the archival collection, Naf offers here the promise of a place for queer Arab Americans and others whose desires and intimate lives did not accord with the disciplinary mechanisms of white heteronormativity. This place lives on within the community record rather than through the internalized shame of rumor. A queer affective method of historical grounded imagining is vital to the work that we need to do for historical knowledge production. This imaginative practice pushes the limitations of how historical records have been produced and curated and how historical evidence has been defined. It helps us recognize those limitations because imagining beyond these boundaries enables us to see what the historical records do not tell us. To imagine critically and historically, however, does not fully redress these archival limitations. Rather than attempting to complete the knowledge or be satisfied with filling the gaps, we must think expansively. We must go beyond traditional disciplinary boundaries and the separations between the imaginative and the scholarly. Such thinking depends on shrinking the facile boundaries between truth and fiction, particularly through the identification and uses of narrative and historical knowledge production. Possible Histories meditates broadly on the queer possibilities of Arab American history. It serves as an incomplete and partial invitation to ask what further possibilities of our history exist. Thank you very much. I'm going to now pass it on to Nayan.
Thanks so much. And I'm really so pleased that you ended this, your presentation with the reading of the work, which is so profound and exciting. And it's been such a pleasure to be part of the process of communicating the importance of the work. I'll just, say right here, it's just such a profound pleasure and honor to be visibly and audibly part of this dialogue here today with all of you at Michigan, and also, very, very much so with Charlotte, who's thinking about through the possibilities of the possibilities and impossibilities of what she's crafted in Possible Histories, Arab Americans and the Queer Ecology of Peddling has been really profoundly exciting to me, because it's been in many ways a way of resurrecting for me a dialogue that I was having around the creation of stranger intimacy. And we first encountered each other as I finished the book, and to feel like there's ways in which you are pushing the boundaries of scholarship in really exciting ways, and in dialogue with so many different kinds of scholars. It's such a profound pleasure. So I want to first begin by really resituating what Dr. Karem Albrecht does in establishing her method and argument for the book as a queer ecology of peddling that at once encompasses labor practices, forms of interdependence and kinship, and intimacies of all kinds across a transient geography and across a variety of different networks. Through this analytical lens, she illuminates the racialized histories of Arab Americans, of Ottoman Syrians, as they become Arab Americans. They're imbricated in both their economic relationships and also in the transitive, sexual, and gendered and racialized system in the United States. This use of the analytic, this queer ecology of peddling, is at once incredibly sophisticated and has so many different possibilities of trying to help us interpret not only the histories that she's unearthing and unraveling for us, but to interpret what is more generally unstable, unexpected, and unruly in historical analysis. So I really want to commend you for this engaging and bold inquiry into historical narrative and queer method and ways of transforming what we can learn about Arab American histories, but also what we can think about in terms of broader representational inquiry practices. So I'm going to continue here to really illuminate this queer historical method that you're using, and to situate that I found it really important to see how you work through a variety of different kinds of material to reveal representation and memory that uses sexual situations, encounters, rumors, possibilities, fears, and fantasies, both, I think, really strikingly to inflame and to make sense of social and cultural crises around gender, sexuality, and race. So I want to begin here and say that Possible Histories is so thoroughly rooted in a scholarship of queer history and queer of color critique, it might be really important for our audience here and for our discussion to talk more about that. And what I see in your work is that you're looking at analysis of queer of color critique that comes from Rod Ferguson's work, from Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation, Emma Perez's decolonial imaginary, as well as a range of other scholars, myself included, and many others who've been trying to think through how we understand the material we're looking at. And I really appreciate the ways in which you talk about your work, not just in terms of this analytic, but a practice that produces a historically grounded imagining of desires, of intimacies and spaces, and possible paths, rather than sticking with a kind of stabilized normative history. And a stabilized normative history is incredibly seductive. It's also for people who have been marginalized and or see themselves as not part of society and embraced. It can be a kind of it is a fantasy of exclusion, and a very important one with real material effects. So I appreciate the ways in which you were looking at that work of how non-conforming and non-normative sexualities and genders have been racialized, how they contribute to so many different elements of social science and policy and state regulation. But obviously your attention is in cultural forms and is in social dynamics. So what is so exciting about your work is that you're showing how profoundly the practices that you can see occurring in this normalizing is doing this work of disciplining and policing and shaming that are part and parcel of the formation of Arab American community as it represents itself to itself, but also to American society as a whole. And I would like us to, I think we can sort of look in the range of work here to sort of see how you're using this peddler thesis to pay attention to the ways in which entrepreneurial skill and resourcefulness is used. Now, for Syrian immigrants, that narrative of entrepreneurial skill and resourcefulness was created as the viable route to American assimilation and white identity status. What's so exciting about your work is you turn it around. You say, well, maybe this can also show and reveal the alternate unconventional ways of understanding immigrant community history through networks and itineracy that are not anchored strictly in settlement, but in fact in transience, and that are really profoundly about this sort of understanding about the kinds of sexual and gender possibilities that are both so strikingly manifest and also in analysis, we're diverted from them for a kind of heteronormative option. So the richness of the work in your first chapters really shows us. I was so struck by what you were doing in chapter 3 and chapter 4, and I want to ask you some more questions about that. I also want to encourage people to really dig into the book. It's really seductive to start off with like how to think about and rethink Oklahoma for sure. And I think that's a great teaser into the project. And it has such a powerful resonance for our contemporary moment because Oklahoma is being revived in some really creative ways. And I think one of the questions, first, let me ask the question I kind of posed to you in a reader's report, and I don't think you were able to work with, but I'm really excited to know what you think about these new retellings of Oklahoma. Is it because it specifically is working around gender and sexuality? It's specifically showing different ways in which that's operating. Do you think that that's an opening for the kind of work you're doing or a different kind of process? Next, like looking at chapter 3, which really looks at the tensions that are occurring in Syrian American community, in periodicals that are so obsessed about women's labor, peddling, their vagrancy, their care networks. I think by showing that community publication, what you do is show us how Arab American elites are managing unfavorable public representations, but also how these tropes of honor and heteronormativity and class anxiety are working within the community. I wonder if you could share with us a little more about what you say there about how race and religion are operating as you analyze gender and sexuality, as women themselves are trying to, you're analyzing this work that's sort of naming and representing the work of Syrian women, but predominantly as Syrian Christians. And I'm just kind of curious if you could say more about that, about how that the routing to white racial identity occurs, how people might be contesting it in a variety of ways. In your 4th chapter, which you showed some images of, but that does not even begin to start with like these amazing array of exciting images that shift us away from the idea of the threat and the violence and policing, which really occupy us during the first half of the book, to centering the homosocial and the homoerotic pleasure. And I wanted you to sort of say more to, speak to more to like the kind of challenges you had in trying to interpret where you see the traces of homosocial and homoerotic in the photographs, where you see different forms of normative kinship making that is homosocial. And most importantly, I think, you know, you raise some really important issues about affect and thinking about affect. And you draw in the work of Gayatri Gopinath and Tina Kampt and Sekovich. And I'd love us to have a kind of more striking conversation about how these found photographs, which in some way we all might have in our family connections, might tell us different ways in which we might create speculative narratives and help us understand that process. Finally, I'm so glad that you both addressed how deeply imbricated you are in the work of Neff's scholarship and our archival collections and her historical curation, but really foregrounded what your analysis and interpretation are doing. It's a beautiful ending of the book where you are recognizing that there's a conversation going on between Neff and her half-sister, Wadad Fren, and you move it into a very clever speculative counter-narrative and analysis. And I'm sure there's more that you even wanted to do than you were able to do here about that counter-narrative, but I'm struck by conversation. There's a conversation between 2 women who have a kind of kinship intimacy, but they're trying to understand things that they both have not experienced together. So they're sharing that information. There's a story about the woman who's at the center of this community of men who, you know, one's father is really cathected to, maybe in a way that's different to other men in the community, but she's rendered in the notes as a leader, as sort of almost a centrifugal force for this community. And that's happening through another form of conversation. And then thirdly, you're engaging with us as readers in a third form of conversation with your audience. And I wanted to sort of ask you to sort of suggest what those three layers of conversation are as they're being recorded in different ways. And what can it reveal about the profound possibilities of your method for showing us that the audience is, and the interlocutor is as important as the object or the text to which you're putting attention to, and that dialogic process is really what is, I think, to me, very centrally important about the ways in which you use speculation, fiction, and imagination to make other narratives possible. But you also use the idea of questioning how we come to our historical knowledge. What stories, what rumors, what hints do we take in order to create the historical knowledge we want to share, and for what community and for what audience? So I think that there might be also this really great moment for you to tell us a little bit about why the volatility of gender is such an interesting element of the ways in which you do your queer peddling method, that it's so important because gender embodiment and desires and pleasures seem to tip established hierarchies and wreck the idea of, a homogenous community, revealing so many other possibilities. And I think it's that policing and governing of normativity are really around ideas about sexuality, but really about gender variance or gender, how gender proliferates so it exceeds certain kinds of normative ideas. And I think that in that process, you not only show us the possibilities that are submerged and repressed, you show us new ways of seeing and knowing. And I think at a moment right now, when in public dialogue, there's so much at stake around gender variance and the public and visible representation of gender, I wonder what you believe your work can tell us, not only about this magnificent way of sort of understanding the past, but also thinking about our contemporary moment, and what you might be seeing reverberating in Arab American communities and history, but also in American history or global histories writ large. So that's my big question at the end, but take up any of these. I'm so excited to be part of this conversation dialogue and learn more about what you're thinking and imagining.
Thank you so much. It's really hard to respond to something like that when you haven't had this experience before. It's just, I'm really grateful to hear your reflections on the book. And I really appreciate these questions. So let's see what I can get to. One of the things that occurred to me as you were talking, before you got to the questions, is that, the heart of this sort of paradox of this form of labor being taken up as this, mode of respectability, is that what I came to understand is that it's not the form of labor that's the mode of respectability. It was actually the action of stopping the labor and showing that we will no longer be mobile, we will no longer be migratory, we will no longer have these questionable affective and sexual attachments, or the suspicion of those things. Right. But that's not what's actually, narrativized in the history that we've had. It's that the form of labor itself showed this kind of entrepreneurial spirit, which for better or worse, that may have been true, but it was also attached to all of these other ideas and points of stigma. So you asked about the revivals of Oklahoma, and throughout the process, people would, ask me about these things, ask me about different productions, or send me things, or tell me, did you see this one? Which I I was not a Oklahoma stan when I came to the project. In fact, it was my advisor, Jigna Desai at Minnesota, who was in Oklahoma in high school and was like, do you know about this peddler character? So that was my introduction to it, right? I have sort of mixed feelings about the revivals. I mean, I'm all for playing with things, different adaptations, like having fun with these forms of cultural production. And I think that there's a way, like some of them really sort of they really stabilize the idea of that the peddler had this sort of like true ethnic or racial background, or that other characters did. And what I think is really important about the peddler is actually the kind of manipulation and sort of route of the identity of the peddler as like initially Syrian, and then maybe Armenian, and then maybe Turkish. No, it was maybe Turkish, maybe Armenian, but maybe we shouldn't be Armenian because, you know, the producers are real Armenian, and then we're going to land on a Persian peddler. But all along, that's going to be a vehicle, except for the original Syrian, all along that's going to be a vehicle for talking about like anti-Semitism, but specifically anti-Ashkenazi. There's never a kind of, you know, allowance for any of those particular national origins being also a Jewish peddler the whole time, right? So I think that gets a little elided in some of the adaptations. I'm not exactly sure how folks would take that up. That's not really my realm. I'm sure someone could, but that's sort of where my ambivalence about it is. It sort of like stabilizes the thing that is maybe so messy about it to begin with. You asked me about the work in chapter 3 to speak a bit more about the imbrication of race and religion in how these conversations among, and I use the word elite to sort of reference the people, the editors and the readers of these periodicals, right? Because we don't know how wide their circulation actually was. In some cases, it was exaggerated, but it was, you know, people who were literate in Arabic language, right? So one of the things that I look at in the chapter is I read some of these debates about Syrian women peddlers' work and all of the efforts that people in or writing to these periodicals did to try and stop that labor. I read it alongside the discussion, the efforts of some Syrians to gain naturalization rights through the statute that required one to be either a quote free white person or a person of African nativity or African descent. And Syrians, like other non-European immigrants, argue that they were free white people. Syrians, for those who don't know, were one of the only groups that were eventually ruled to be able to naturalize, right? And so that, as a result, ruled them to be legally white. And the kind of discourse or the kind of argumentation that was used, and this is where Sarah Gualtieri's first book is really, instructive about how this happened. They drew on these sort of like racialized religious discourses, and they emphasized their Christianity, the fact that most of them were Christian, and the fact that they came from, the land of Jesus's birth. And they also work to distance themselves from the racialized ideas of Islam and Muslims, which, despite their Christianness, right, they were always sort of associated by other people with Islam. And to a certain extent, that was appropriate, right? Because culturally, Islam was very much a part of their experience, even though they were Christians. So I look at this as like another way of understanding sort of like the sexual dimensions of this argumentation for naturalization, using Siobhan Somerville's work to talk about how, these arguments for naturalization are about a kind of idealized reproductive citizen, someone who will reproduce the nation, right? So that's some of the ways that I do that in chapter 3. Maybe I'm sort of speeding through these, but let's see. You asked me about chapter 4, where I look at these photographs and the challenges of sort of differentiating between or identifying. homosocial intimacies that might be normative versus homoerotic intimacies. And I think one of the challenges is that understanding the sort of multiple and conflicting realms of what's considered normative and non-normative. And I wanted to both put aside the assumption that homoerotic intimacies are always non-normative, and also somewhat contradictorily, allow for homosociality as normative in a Syrian context, right? And even in some cases at the time in an American context, depending on sort of valences of class and race and geography. And I think that what I'm doing there, or what I'm trying to do, is that it's not definitive, right? So certainly somebody could challenge that. One of the things that I don't know, if this would actually happen, but, one of the things that I worried about at some point was like, what if a descendant of these folks, saw this and said, well, there's no way that was true, right? These folks were all straight, and, somebody could be really upset by it. And that both could be true and also may not be true, right? That this sort of impossibility of fully knowing what someone's desires were, what someone's intimate experiences were, what someone's relationship to their kin was, right? That there's something that I wanted to play with in there, which I think sort of leads me a little bit into your last question about these layers of conversation, that these were things happening between people, both historically and in the archive historically, right? When maybe some of this historical material was being produced, like oral histories, and between me and eventual or imagined readers of the book. I think that one of the things that the points that I proceed from is that this knowledge and history is not a static thing, that you can just sort of move from any direction and valence point and it will be the same, it will look the same, it will produce the same outcomes or consequences. And I sort of like this kind of destabilizing effect that the conversation may change depending on who you are talking to, depending on what kinds of assumptions you're bringing to it, and what kinds of desires you're bringing to it, right? You can't set aside your own personal stakes in something. It doesn't mean that everything has to be dictated by your personal stakes, right? But I can't look at those photographs. I can't look at the notes and hear that conversation between Alexa Nath and Wadad Friend and just have a kind of come to some kind of, detached conclusion about what it does or doesn't show, right? There's some way that I am forced to reckon with what I would like to be there, what I would like to find. And I think some of that does intersect with like the, contemporary kinds of exigencies around what it means to be a queer person, to think about, your who you're descended from, how you sort of make sense of that in the world. I do think, I really appreciate your comments about gender. One of the things that I've been reflecting on, I'm teaching a seminar right now with Scott Larson called Queer and Trans Historicism. So I'm getting to read a lot of trans studies scholarship, which I haven't really been able to before. But one of the things that, it certainly occurred to me along the way in this book is that a lot of this would be different analysis and would change in ways that I would be excited about if I had been able to really incorporate, I think, trans studies critiques around gender. And Scott, sorry, Scott's not here, but I'm going to talk about him anyway, said to me when we were talking about it the other day that he felt that the second chapter, which is a chapter that talks about women's labor and social workers' ideas about it, is a very trans chapter, like that there's a lot of just the things happening with gender in that, right? All of these things about what determines a proper woman, right? These are not things that really can be contained within the assumption of cis normativity and heteronormativity, right? So I agree with you, right? That gender is this really important point, ideological realm through which so many of these ideas and anxieties and outcomes pass. I do think that I don't tend to like connect my work to today. I'm not a kind of historian who's like, can't make these kinds of connections. But just, I haven't done that a lot with this work, but it is a little difficult when we have this kind of national sweep of particularly anti-trans movements that, to be clear, are being spearheaded and created by the Christian nationalist right. And those things are also being taken up, for instance, in Dearborn by a largely Arab American Muslim community. But they're connected, right? So, but these same kinds of concerns or, bifurcation between Arabness and queerness and transness. I mean, folks are talking about people who are already in their families and their communities, right? And part of this, I think, came out of my frustration of always seeing, talking about homophobia and trans antagonism as something that only queer and trans people really need to deal with, right? So you look at this history, and all of these ideas affected Syrians regardless of who they actually desired and who they actually slept with, right? So I think that that's some of what I, was left with as a result, and that I think about, right? We're going to continue to be stuck with some of these things unless a larger group of people actually take it up as their own urgent issue.
Thanks so much. That was great. And I would just say that on the last part, I definitely feel like what the sort of whole, or the reckoning around gender variance tells you, and the ways in which it's being policed and the way it's being designated is about these sort of ongoing crises, of which many people are enlisted to both do the policing, but also pretend as if it only is narrowly targeted. But in fact, your work shows how broadly targeted it is, and why it is that people may have felt very elusive about the ways in which they may have communicated about themselves, and particularly at that time. But also, it seems like it's more of a kind of cudgel of non-normativity that's being produced that then gets racialized and is definitely playing itself out by religion and class in a variety of different ways. So, but let's go on to the broader questions you have. It looks like there's several that are coming up.
Yeah. Thank you. Oh, Juan, I think that you are muted.
I'll read out the questions. Thank you both for that wonderful and enlightening conversation around this important new book. Before we start the question and answer, I do want to thank our co-sponsors, the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies, the Institute for Research on Women and Gender, Middle East Studies Department, and the Department of History and Women's and Gender Studies. Thank you all, along with Amas and GISC, for hosting this, contributing to this event. So let me pick and choose here. A question comes in. Do you think that queer communities honor some of the same historical traditions you mentioned today? If so, how?
Let's see. I mean, I saw this question. I'm not certain which traditions that might be mentioned. I will say that, like, peddling itself, if that's what this person is talking about, wasn't something that in this iteration lasted as there were, more and more like things like mail catalogs, right? More and more businesses that were being built in rural areas, better transportation and infrastructure, that people had less need for it, right? So certainly by the middle of the 20th century, there were very few peddlers still going, although some of them still did peddle in different ways. And of course, peddling is something that still happens all over the world, right? As forms of labor that people do, but specifically in this community. I think that, I think it's very seductive to draw sort of a line between queer people, or who people we identify as queer in the past and those in the present. And I actually, speaking of this, the seminar, read recently a part of Hill Malatino's beautiful book called Trans Care. And there's a chapter in there called Something Other Than Transcestors, which I would really recommend for anyone sort of thinking about like histories of queerness, transness, and lineage or inheritance or continuancy, things like that. And I think it is, I think we can't just sort of say, this was something happened back then and we've continued it today, right? I'm carrying on the legacy. And one of the reasons is because we still can't fully know what the intentions were of people then, what their desires were. I mean, many of the people that I am looking at are not people who were like leaving lots of materials about their own lives, certainly ones that I'm finding in like social welfare, case studies, right? So I think it's complicated, right? So any kind of sort of like, gratification I might draw from this as a queer Arab American person today is always, I think, tempered. It's not a sort of simplistic lineage that I can draw from. Thank you for the question.
So Alia writes, hi, Charlotte, so great to hear you talking about your wonderful book. Can you say more about the relation between queerness and racialized citizenship or Americanness for the Syrian immigrant community you study? Relatedly, to what extent did Syrians distance themselves from identities as subjects of the Ottoman Empire?
Right. So first, I should say that Syrians had a range of relationships to the Ottoman Empire as a political entity and to the Ottoman Sultan. There were some that were had very strong critiques of the Ottoman Empire and that regime. Others who wanted to be sort of incorporated into it or maintain their incorporation in different ways. There's also a lot of people that we really don't know because we're left with sort of the writings of folks, which is a class-bound group of people. But I appreciate that question. I think is important in terms of understanding, additional aspects of who these folks were and how they oriented themselves in the world. About the relationship between queerness and racialized citizenship and specifically Americanness. So the premise that I began with was thinking about if Syrians who in the early part of the 20th century eventually were ruled to be able to naturalize, right, and were ruled legally white, and if more and more Syrians began to think about themselves as white or internalize that ruling in some way, what were the other things, other aspects of how they were in the world, right? How they understood themselves, how they related to other people. What were other things that were required in order to fully access whiteness, right? Or further access whiteness. And so what I began to understand is that moments in which you can see Syrians, being portrayed as deviating from a very particular white middle to upper class American sexual norm, that then also, jeopardized their standing as potentially or actually white people as well, right? That essentially the norms of citizenship are not just or only about race in this moment in which they're explicitly stated as a racial prerequisite. They're also about what is the capacity of citizenship, right? How is that understood? What is a modern, civilized subject that the United States was understanding or presuming to be like the ideal person, right? And that person was someone who comported themselves in very specific ways in relation to the gender binary and to heterosexism, right? Because it was someone who was expected to reproduce the nation in a particular way, right? Both literally and figuratively.
So Christopher Ewing writes, how did you navigate attempts of your historical subjects to obscure non-normative pleasures with the historian's objective to recuperate or even reimagine queerness in the past? What resistances did you encounter from the very people you're studying?
Well, so the very people that I'm studying, I mean, as perhaps a cop-out, are not living. So I didn't have immediate resistance from those folks. I will say that I had a potential opportunity to meet Elixa Naff as a young graduate student, and I didn't because I was frankly worried about how I would handle it. And, you know, this project followed me for a long time, and I am a different person now and when I published the book than when I started the project. So in some ways I regret that, but in other ways I'm not sure that I had the maturity then to navigate that process in the best way, right? Because I came to it initially just critiquing the hell out of her work, right? And then realizing like I'm critiquing this work and I'm relying so heavily on it. Like I would have nothing. I would have not very much, you know, if I wasn't using these collections. So I had to really think how I was understanding my relationship to her and to her research. But I've certainly encountered some resistance to the kind of conclusions I draw, and especially from the kind of imagining of queer, homosocial, homoerotic, and even homosocial relationships. And it's especially come from this kind of assertion that homosociality is not homoeroticism, right? That there's this kind of, you know, very clear dividing line. And one of the things that I say, which is not original to me, many other people, like particularly like Gayatri Gopinath, has said, is that, you know, homosociality opens up the opportunity for homoeroticism, right? There's you cannot foreclose the possibility of homoeroticism within homosocial spaces, and homosocial spaces are really central to, or was really central to these Syrian migrant cultures themselves, right? So that is the main, I think, the main form of resistance. My guess is the other form of resistance is just probably avoidance, right? People can choose whether or not they would like to take up the work.
So Joseph, Awad wants to know, how does the non-normativity aspect of Arab queerness specifically relate to the current discussion of those that are queer within the Levant today?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think again that I wouldn't draw like a direct line between those in the past and those in the present. I do think that folks in various parts of the Middle East today deal with a very different landscape around queer and trans issues than those in diaspora. There's connections, right, between diasporic groups and those who are not, who haven't left, right, or whose ancestors didn't leave. But there's both, I think, legal realities that can be different. There's norms around how public space, how people use public space, how people relate to, like norms of family and kinship, which are things that even in Arab communities and diaspora do change in diaspora, right? There's this kind of, this is Nadine Neber's work, like there's this kind of idea that Arab culture is this kind of, singular, like unchanging thing that we have to defend and protect. And the moment you have migrated, right, it has changed. And it also changes back home, right? So those kinds of things affect how Arab queers are living their queerness, how they think about what's possible for them, but also they live today within this really globalized culture based in the global north of the terms of legibility of being, so-called LGBTQ plus, right? Or other such things. And that is can affect sort of the things that people have access to or not in terms of thinking about queerness, but also things like, organizations and money and sort of funding for different kinds of things. But then there are localized groups and strategies that happen in these places that just may not be also legible to or available to people in other places, and they don't necessarily need to be. I'm not sure if that answers the question, Joseph. I mean, there's a lot to think about there, though. I appreciate it.
So Alifa Chaudhry asks, in the current realm of history, which characterize queer history as Western history, how does one consolidate the taboo associated with queerness in non-Western communities and the reality that queer communities existed with them nonetheless?
This is a great question. Thank you. I think about a couple of things. I think one thing is about, exploring histories in the places themselves that denaturalize heterosexuality as a kind of static and fundamental organizing principle that has existed for all time, because it hasn't, and it hasn't in the so-called West either. And I think, education about the history of Orientalism and the intersection between Orientalism, colonialism, and imperialism, and how regimes of sexual and gender non-normativity have been taken up in that, right? So we have histories in which European colonists saw the Middle East and North Africa as a site of sexual excess, sexual abundance, excessive sexual freedom, right? Which is one of the things that Syrians actually worried about in the United States. One of the things that I discuss in chapter 3. And that at a certain point, as the norms in Europe and North America change about what it means to be human, what it means to be modern, right? As those things change, so too then do the terms through which the Middle East and North Africa is seen on this kind of global stage, right? Where you start to get this sort of flip, right? That no longer is this the site that is the other to Europe, right? Because there's a kind of excessive freedom in terms of sexuality, but now it's a site that is the other because there's a kind of intense repression because of sexuality, right? So how do we look at these things and think, one of these things is like the true aspect of this place, right? Neither is, right? This is all a function of that imperial process, right? That is ongoing.
Nancy Khalil writes in, thanks so much to all for this program, especially Char and Nayan. Can you share more about the methods of possibility? How do you do that in a way that others can learn from it and potentially incorporate it? You're starting a movement, are you?
Thanks, Nancy. This is a great question. So one of the things that I would say is that I've done a lot of reading of other people who use speculative work, speculative methods, Saidiya Hartman, Emma Perez, other people who are thinking about especially like histories of violence. And when you're recording histories of violence, how incomplete those histories are, right? And so then to just sort of retell the history of violence also does violence in and of itself, right? So those folks are thinking about, well, what else do we do from there? Is there a kind of imagining that we can do? Is some of this potentially reparative, right? So it's not as if to say that you can just sort of imagine and fill in the blanks, but I do think that there's a number of folks that are doing really careful work to think about what do we know about this time and place and what people were experiencing, and what are some of the things that we might be able to restore in a way that honors people's, capacity for love, right? Capacity for empathy, their kinship, right? Their humanity in all these ways. So the other thing that I would say is that I don't necessarily do this with everything that I encounter, but I do look for moments that feel, and I think this is why it's a queer method, right? A lot of queer studies scholars and historians of sexuality have talked about this, that it's like that there's something off about this, right? You actually have to use your own affective encounter with the material to determine when is this a time that there's something more that needs to be explored here. And when you do the something more that you need to be explored here, that needs to be explored, I don't think anyone, would be so presumptuous as to say, like, I've figured it out. That's what this is, right? It's about like opening up of further kind of exploration, right? And not sort of sealing off the historical narrative to just the materials that we have that are foreclosed already by these structures of heteronormativity, of white supremacy, and so on.
Yeah, if I might use my platform to intervene, I would say that some of what you're doing has a lot of relevance for other fields, and the history of Victorian sexuality is written in what, as an outsider, what I view as a very strange way. I've been working on Edward Fitzgerald, who translated the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and he's clearly, that poem and the translation of it came out of a failed queer relationship. And Fitzgerald himself was clearly what we would now think of, at least as queer. And the major biographies of Fitzgerald completely covered this up. And the descendants of the people involved, got rid of the incriminating letters. So you have to read the letters in a certain way to understand them. When Fitzgerald says his friendships are like love affairs, and when he says that when his one of his acquaintances said he fell in love with every embryo Apollo. I mean, it and then if you look at his translations, it becomes fairly clear. But you do have to, be willing to read the material in a certain way, and most historians of the Victorian period have not been.
Juan, I actually see a question in here I'd like to answer. Can I go ahead and do that?
Well, is it Amira's?
Yes, that's one, and then there's another.
Yeah, no, certainly. Let me read Amira's.
Okay, great.
Thanks so much for your amazing work, Charlotte. I think we are used to thinking about peddling as an activity that happens or happened away from the home space, but your work incorporates those who stayed home into the ambit of peddling. Can you talk more about this ecology, as you call it?
Yes. Thank you. And I also just want to very publicly thank Amira Jarmarkani, because she was also one of the readers for this book and has given me so much support over the years. So thank you for being here, Amira. So one of the things that I talk about is how peddling was not something that was sustainable just by the work of peddlers alone, or even just by the work of peddlers and the suppliers from, say, a dry goods store or an import store. What you had was a lot of Syrians, mainly women, who were making things like doing lace work, embroidery, sewing dust caps, things like this, that they were doing inside their homes, right? While they were taking care of kids or cleaning or doing other things. And some of them were gathering together in a single home and doing these things that they were making items that peddlers were then going to take and sell, right? So that's one of the ways, particularly, that women's labor was supporting the peddling economy. Another was, as I mentioned, raising kids and taking care of elders, right? So not all peddlers were long distance peddlers. Some would be gone just for a day. That's probably the primary way that women peddlers peddled, was just going for a day and coming back. Some of those women also ended up putting children in the care of others in order to go for longer periods of time. But long distance peddlers, who were often men, or that if a woman was doing that, she was often accompanied by a male relative, you know, somebody had to take care of other things back in their home, right, while they were gone. And so those were largely women doing other forms of unpaid domestic labor. And then the third aspect of this sort of broadening of peddling are the folks who owned and operated boarding houses, which is where many peddlers, longer distance peddlers, would stay after usually about a week, right, of moving from one town to another. And Syrian women often operated these, and these in particular were a site of a lot of, you know, scrutiny and gossip about who stayed there, about what could possibly happen there, right? And you also had some places that functioned as sort of boarding rooms where a bunch of people were just sleeping on a floor together at the same time. And those could be young people, married people, single people, you know, all genders of people who were peddlers in the same room, right? So these were ways of sort of, you know, cohabitating, at least temporarily, that were not normative for how people would live outside of peddling.
And Charlotte, you said you saw another question you want to take on. Why don't you just go ahead and do that?
Yeah, so there's an anonymous question that I appreciate, because I do think that many people would ask this. And it says, do you experience any tension when approaching the histories of a non-Western group like Syrian immigrants and applying a methodology, imagining a non-conforming sexual and gender history that can be attributed as very Western? So I wanted to answer this question because I think the assumption or the attribution of non-conforming sexuality and gender as a Western concept is itself false, right? And the maintenance of that is what keeps, first of all, if we're going to talk about real people today, it keeps queer and trans Arabs and other Middle Eastern folks sort of in an impossible situation, right? Sometimes feeling like they're forced to choose between family and community of origin and a so-called Western queer and trans community, right? It's a false dichotomy. And the methods themselves don't come necessarily from Eurocentric ways of thinking about history, Eurocentric ways of thinking about gender and sexuality, right? They in particular come from queer of color scholars of sexuality and gender who, you know, do a really robust interdisciplinary critique and examination of large structures like the history of colonialism, chattel slavery, migration, capitalism, right, which are very Western, right, in their in many ways in their application, right, but are not things that are especially directly impacting just Western people, right? These are global South impacts. So that's how I would say that, like this, there's not a tension in this project, right? It is an Arab American queer project, and there's not a tension in that.
Well, thank you. I think we've come to the end of our time, unfortunately. It's been a scintillating set of conversations. Thanks so much to our speakers, Charlotte and Nayan, and all of our co-sponsors. And as a reminder, if you want to hear about similar events from the Global Islamic Studies, sign up for the GISC newsletter. Thank you for attending.
Thank you all so much.
Congratulations, and buy the book.
Thank you, Nayan.